periodically our media presents articles and programs on miracles, and they primarily focus things that miracles can happen anywhere, and I think it does. So a poem that I received titled Moments used a similar theme, but it stresses faith as the driving force for miracles. Let's listen to what Oliver French, the author, tells us. This day the roses glow, and silver lights shone through the leaves nearby. 5 minutes, that was all, and then the sun set. No picture captured this moment, which remains only in my eye and heart. But faith is the knowledge that such moments come again in other guises when we are not looking for miracles. During my recent high school class reunion, I met one of my friends that I hadn't seen for a long time, and he discussed with me what he thought was the miracle that happened to him. Tail gunner on a B-24, B-17, sorry, was flying through the last mission over Gresham. His airplane was hit with flak. The crew was ordered to bail out. My friend bailed out. However, his feet got stuck in the tail gate. He fluttered around, he prayed and he prayed. He wouldn't move. Suddenly, the airplane took a slight shift in attitude, took the centrifugal pressure off of his leg, and he fell out of the plane. Seconds later, the airplane exploded. I saw Bill several hours later, and he was still thinking in terms of that miracle. So when we think of some of the friends that we have in this room, who are still living, God bless them, and all those that have passed forward, well, let's remember that many of those people actually lived through a miracle. Let us fetch the flag by Bill, please.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Now Mr. Thomas Kimmel will be our speaker. Thank you for coming. One thing I'd like to mention before he starts, Tom made a trip up to Florida for us. That's where he lives. So thank you for making the trip up to Florida.
There we go.
Technical problem, ladies and gentlemen.
Nothing new to us. It's all right, this can be edited. There we go.
It's always an exciting time for me when I have these technical problems. Brandon Traister.
Yes, sir.
I got that right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir, for that effusive, inflated, hyperbolic introduction that I provided for you. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me all right in the back?
Yes.
As you see before you, I have a list of many talks that I give. It takes me some 9 hours to give those talks. you'll be delighted to know that I'm not going to give all of them to you this afternoon. What I am going to give to you is a story within the Pearl Harbor story, augmented, because I have a little extra time. And indeed, there is a story within the Pearl Harbor story. It's a story of a nation under attack for 5 years, to be sure, but it's also the story of a man under attack for 66 years. A conscientious man of probity who has been humiliated, disgraced, and scapegoated for 66 years. That man is my grandfather. I'm his eldest grandson. The giants of World War II, Nimitz, Halsey, King, Spruance, Kincaid, Burke, Yarnell, Richardson, and a host of others have variously described the scapegoating of Admiral Kimmel as, and I quote, wrong, most unfair, unjust, deceptively dishonest, despicable, and disgraceful. Ladies and gentlemen, that was over 60 years ago. It's all the more disgraceful today because, thanks to Admiral Kimmel, we know so much more about the Pearl Harbor story than we did then. I ask you, is it important that a naval officer should live to see his 41 years of unblemished service annihilated in a little more than 41 minutes? Well, the Congress of the United States thinks that it is. I ask you further, is it important that we finally stop tolerating Pearl Harbor perjury and that we stop perpetuating the myth that Admiral Kimmel and General Short were solely blamable for the success of the Japanese attack and derelict in their duty? Once again, the Congress of the United States, the voice of the people, thinks that it is. And that's why the Congress passed a law recommending in perpetuity that the President of the United States, whoever he is now, or whoever he or she may be in the future, posthumously advance Rear Admiral Kimmel and Major General Short to their highest held temporary ranks in World War II of Admiral and Lieutenant General, respectively, in accordance with the Officer Personnel Act of 1947. But this administration refuses to do so, and refuses, they tell us, to bring this important matter of national honor to the attention of the President of the United States, and refuses to provide the American public with available and requested information explaining why. I ask you, what is the effect of this administration's refusal to implement the Congress's recommendation? Well, number one, clearly it mocks the Congress. Number two, inexplicably, it continues to tolerate Pearl Harbor perjury. Number three, it ignores the advice of the longest tenured Chief of Naval Operations in the United States history, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harley Burke, who made it abundantly clear to the Vice President of the United States that this matter of advancement of Kimmel on the retired list is important not because of its importance to the Kimmel family, but because of its importance to the United States Navy as an institution. And number 4, of course, it perpetuates the myth that Admiral Kimmel and General Short are solely blamed for the success of the Japanese attack at derelict in Manila, as they are the only 2 persons otherwise qualified under the Officer Personnel Act of 1947 not to receive the benefits of the Officer Personnel Act of 1947. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the only 2 persons officially punished for the success of the Japanese attack. It is great fun for me to speak to groups, especially in this pretty intimate setting here. I like it this way. And if you're only able to take one thing away with you from our time together, please hear this. If we continue to ignore the lessons we should have learned from the Pearl Harbor attack, the lessons the Pearl Harbor survivors have been trying to teach us now for 66 years, then we are doomed to repeat the errors of the Pearl Harbor attack, as I would suggest that we have done and are doing with the 9/11 attack, and I fear we will do with the next attack. So what should we do about it? Well, how's this for a 3-step action plan? Number 1, let's remember Pearl Harbor and keep America alert, the very motto of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. Number 2, let's officially determine true accountability for the success of the Pearl Harbor attack. And that's what we're going to do today. Number 3, let's officially determine true accountability for the success of the 9/11 attack. Nobody in the Kimmel family is trying to abduct accountability. What we're looking for is true accountability. Okay, now it's time to put some flesh on these bones. Stay with me, ladies and gentlemen. With a little bit of effort on your part, I promise you an investigation to determine true accountability for the success of the Japanese attack. I promise you some facts you have never heard before. I promise you some free stuff. And hopefully some fun along the way. After all, it is my job this afternoon to talk. It is your job to listen. Ladies and gentlemen, should you finish before I do, then God bless you. I'm often asked, what's the best book on Pearl Harbor? Yes, I am biased. It's my grandfather's book, Admiral Kimmel's story. It's a terrific book. I'm not here to sell you a book. You can find this book beautifully rendered online, the whole book, at that website. If for some reason you're unable to obtain it at that website, send me an email, and I will make sure that you are able to get it electronically. As a matter of fact, if you send me an email, I'll send you all kinds of stuff, whether you want it or not. I'm often asked, what's the best book currently on Pearl Harbor? Without doubt, the strongest book that I can recommend for you is this one by Professor Michael Gannon, Professor Emeritus, University of Florida, a marvelous gentleman and a scholar. He had access to all 30,000 pages of my grandfather's papers, which are housed at the University of Wyoming. And the reason I know he had access is because I have it all on microfilm, and I gave him access to the microfilm. He did much work, much good work with that microfilm, and came up with all kinds of brand new information, which is contained in that book. Now, I can't send you that book. There are some copyright considerations there. But if you give me an email, I can send you the essence of the book. The essence of the book was printed in the Naval Institute of Proceedings in 1994 in an extraordinarily competent, pertinent article that he prepared, and I can give you that. As a matter of fact, You can go to my website, which you see there, pearlharbor911tax.com, and you can get all of this material, and then a whole lot more. There's a story, ladies and gentlemen, within the Pearl Harbor story. This is part of the story. That's my dad, Naval Academy, 1936. That's my grandfather, Admiral Kimmel, Naval Academy, class of '04. My dad's older brother, Uncle Manning, Naval Academy, class of '35. And this gentleman is my great-grandfather, Admiral Kimmel's father. It continues to amaze me when I reflect upon the fact that I knew somebody very well, Admiral Kimmel, whose father fought in the Civil War. Grandpa Kimmel, Manning Kimmel, Major Marius Manning Kimmel, graduated from West Point in the class of '57. That would be 1857. As I'm sure you've already figured out, perilously close to the Civil War. And indeed, my grandfather fought the first battle of Bull Run, or Manassas if you prefer, with the United States Army. He was from Kentucky. After the battle, he went back to Kentucky, resigned his commission, considered his options, and opted to fight the rest of the war for the Confederate States Army. And fight he did. He fought at Vicksburg, Holly Spring, Corinth, Pea Ridge. He fought with Magruder's, Raiders, and a host of other lesser engagements, and miraculously survived the war. Or we would not be having this conversation this evening. These are the 3 submarines that my dad was on in World War II. Again, miraculously surviving Lingayen Gulf, if you're familiar with that battle, and numerous other hairbreadth escapes. His older brother was also on 3 submarines. He was on Drum at Midway, Raton, where you can see they sank everything in sight, and then he was the commanding officer of Romulo in the Balabac Straits, which is the Philippines, in 1944-45, when the ship, the boat, was lost with all hands. Nothing was ever recovered. That's why we're not exactly sure when she was lost. Admiral Kimmel had 3 sons. The older boy that was killed in the war, my dad, who deceased in 1997, a career naval officer, and a much younger son, Ned Kimmel, who deceased in 2005, a much younger son who also fought in World War II aboard Navy ships, the Vixen and the Ranger. But he strayed badly and went to the Ivy League, graduating from Princeton and Harvard Law School. He is largely responsible for obtaining that legislation that I alluded to before. This photograph, ladies and gentlemen, is perhaps my favorite photograph of all time. And the reason for it is simple, because I know exactly how difficult it was for the Time Life photographers who took this photograph in 1991 to get both my dad and my uncle smiling at the same time like they are here. This is my first ship out of the Naval Academy, my second ship, my third ship. This represents my 25 years in the FBI, another year and a half on contract. And now to the heart of the matter. The Joint Congressional Committee summed up their investigation as an attempt in 1945 and 46 to answer one paramount question. This is right out of their report. Why, with some of the finest intelligence available in our history, was it possible for a Pearl Harbor to occur? Pretty good question. the official investigations of Pearl Harbor had to try and answer that question. The 9/11 Commission should have tried to answer that question updated as to how 9/11 could occur. So what's the answer? Well, the grand old man of the Pacific, the man who relieved my grandfather, Admiral Nimitz, made it abundantly clear what he thought the answer was, and I consider it the apposite comment of all of the Pearl Harbor investigations. The most pertinent, relevant, material thing to come out of all of the investigations was a comment by Admiral Nimitz, in my opinion, in my very biased opinion. What did Admiral Nimitz have to say about that question? Admiral Kimmel had been given no information which would justify interrupting a very urgent training program. That's pretty much the sum and substance of Admiral Kimmel's defense right there. If you'd like a secondary answer, it comes from Admiral Kimmel's predecessor, Admiral J.O. Richardson. To refresh your recollection, Admiral J.O. Richardson was the admiral who did not want the fleet at Pearl Harbor and made his misgivings so stridently known to the President of the United States that President Roosevelt fired him and replaced him with my grandfather. That's how my grandfather got the job. This is what Admiral Richardson had to say in answer to the question, the paramount question of the Joint Congressional Committee. The subordinates in a military organization cannot stand with their arms raised in protected alertness forever. Some superior has to ring a bell that moves the subordinate to the center of the ring. That bell was never rung by Kimmel's superiors in Washington, D.C. So we've heard from what Admiral Kimmel's predecessor said, what his successor said. Let's go across the pond to this rather clairvoyant Englishman, Captain Russell Grenfell. This would be a tertiary answer to the question, the paramount question, how is it possible to occur? No reasonably informed person can now believe that Japan made a surprise attack on the United States. The attack was not only fully expected, but it was actually desired. It was beyond doubt that President Roosevelt wanted to get his country into the war. Japan was meant by the American president to attack the United States. I often reflect on this remarkable statement by Winston Churchill. That there are many kinds of maneuvers in war, some only of which take place in the battlefield. The maneuver which brings an ally into the field is every bit as serviceable as winning a great battle. And I might add that Joseph Stalin could have said exactly the same thing with the same applicability to the Pearl Harbor attack. Okay, here's the real story within the Pearl Harbor story, ladies and gentlemen. You have it laid out before you right here. 9 days after the Pearl Harbor attack. And you can compare this to 9/11 if you like. I actually do that in one of my talks. 9 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, the President of the United States found a sitting Supreme Court Associate Justice, Owen Roberts, to head a commission to investigate the Army and the Navy only, and then only in Hawaii. 10 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, my grandfather was fired and replaced, as was General Short, the head of the Army Hawaiian Department. 11 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, sitting Supreme Court Associate Justice Owen Roberts began his deliberations, his investigations. He investigated for a grand total of 36 days. 47 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Roberts Commission issued a report, sent it to the President of the United States, unredacted. The President of the United States signed it and gave it to the press and sent it around the world, accusing my grandfather and General Short of dereliction of duty, which really means abandonment of duty, and claimed they were solely responsible for the success of the Japanese attack. 47 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, End of the story, soup to nuts. And that's the way the matter stood, ladies and gentlemen, for years. For years. Specifically, until February 21st, 1944, when this man, Captain Lawrence Safford, the head of what the Navy calls OC-20G, the head of Naval Communications Intelligence, indeed, the father, the revered father of Naval Communications Intelligence, Captain Lawrence Safford, went to see my grandfather in Bronxville, New York, February 21st, 1944. He went to see Admiral Kimmel and he said, Admiral Kimmel, did you have available to you at Pearl Harbor prior to the attack the same information that we had available to us in Washington, D.C. prior to the attack? In a program that we codenamed Magic, that gave us, prior to the attack, Admiral, indications of the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the place of the attack, the reason for the attack, and the deceit plan to cover the attack. Again, Admiral, in a program that we called Magic. Admiral Kimmel turned to Captain Safford and said, Captain, what in the world are you talking about? What is magic? Captain Safford explained. That very day, February 21st, my grandfather went from a despondent, beaten man, perfectly capable of suicide. He turned into a fighting tiger. He got himself a law firm out of Boston. A marvelous gentleman by the name of Ed Hannaford actually wrote the enabling legislation that he took to the Naval Affairs Committee. Dewey Short was the chairman. Dewey Short so impressed the Congress that he got the Congress to pass a law ordering the Army and the Navy to conduct further investigations. Or there would have been no further investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack 47 days after the attack. This is the real story within the Pearl Harbor story. One man's determination, my grandfather's determination to get the facts of the Pearl Harbor story before the American public. Ladies and gentlemen, all 8 of these subsequent investigations were caused to happen directly as a result of the efforts of Admiral Kimmel or Admiral Kimmel's family. Specifically, the last one was caused to happen by Admiral Kimmel's 2 surviving sons. Let me ask you this. You see 10 official investigations of the Pearl Harbor attack. How many of these investigations accorded Admiral Kimmel the opportunity to defend himself? And by defend himself, I mean the opportunity to call and cross-examine witnesses in his own defense, as the Bill of Rights would so indicate would be appropriate. But you want to hazard a guess? You want to hazard a guess out loud?
Zero.
Exactly right. 1. The Naval Court of Inquiry. Naval Court of Inquiry was the only investigation that accorded Admiral Kimmel the opportunity to defend himself, the opportunity to call and cross-examine witnesses. So what did the Naval Court of Inquiry find? The Naval Court of Inquiry found, number 1, there was not a scintilla of evidence to support a charge of dereliction of duty against Admiral Kimmel. Number 2, Admiral Kimmel committed no errors of judgment. No errors of judgment on the basis of information that he was given. Number 3, the court approved of all of Admiral Kimmel's forced dispositions, again, on the basis of information that he was given. The president of the court, Admiral Murfin, opined that they thought Admiral Kimmel had done everything possible under the circumstances, under the political circumstances. And they made one last finding, and that was to severely criticize Admiral Kimmel's only uniformed boss, Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark in Washington, D.C., for not keeping Admiral Kimmel appropriately and adequately informed as to what was going on. It is impossible to have an understanding of the Pearl Harbor story without knowing a little something about magic. The definition of magic. Magic was a code word for the secret American decoding of Japanese diplomatic and spy communications. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the only communications we were intercepting and decoding prior to the Pearl Harbor attack were diplomatic communications. That is an enormously misleading idea. The spy communications were being read like a book by us, and they had nothing to do with diplomacy. Magic, prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, provided indications of the time of the attack, the place of the attack, the reason for the attack, and the deceit plan to cover the attack, to hide the attack. If there was one fact that all of these investigations unassailably established, it was that Hawaii, Admiral Kimmel and General Short had no magic. None. However, Washington, D.C., Manila, in the Philippines, meaning General MacArthur, the head of the Army out of the Philippines, and Admiral Hart, the Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet, the United States Asiatic Fleet, they had magic, as did the British. The British had magic because we gave it to them, but Hawaii had none. To borrow language from the 9/11 Commission, let me ask you this. What was the single greatest structural cause for, remember the language? Attorney General John Ashcroft, for national television, said the single greatest structural cause for 9/11. Do you remember that marvelous play on television? Anyway, I've adopted that language. What was the single greatest structural cause for the Pearl Harbor attack, for the success of the Pearl Harbor attack? Anybody? The prime error lay in keeping from the Hawaiian commanders the contents of the consular messages. What is another word for consular? I heard it. Spy messages. That's it. These are the spies. The spy messages. Especially the bomb plot series. The fact that Washington did not evaluate this information at its real worth is inexcusable. No attempt to explain away or minimize these messages stands up before their content. The book, incidentally, I don't recommend. Loaded with egregious errors. I may get to that, I don't know. But on this point, pretty good. What are the authors talking about? Prang, Goldstein, and Dillon. What are they talking about? They're talking about, in the main, these 147 ships in harbor messages. These are the spy messages. 5 months prior to Pearl Harbor, right up to the very day of the attack, Japanese spies sent 147 messages. That's all, 147. We're not talking about 14,000, we're talking about 147. Ships in harbor messages. We were reading most of them. Everywhere except, of course, in Hawaii. 68 of these messages applied to Pearl Harbor. 55 of them applied to the Philippines. 18 applied to the Panama Canal. And 6 applied to Seattle, Washington. Even if we weren't reading them, which we were, the very numbers told the story. The graphic demonstrates, tries to demonstrate that General MacArthur and Admiral Hart in the Philippines had access to all this information. And of course, Washington, D.C. did as well. The items that are in purple are meant to be from the diplomatic intercepts. What you see by MacArthur's name is a medal. Anybody identify the medal? General MacArthur was given a Congressional Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines. He was awarded that medal on April 1st, 1942, after losing half of his planes on the ground. General MacArthur was one of the great heroes of the Republic. Nonetheless, he had greater reason not to be surprised at Pearl Harbor by far than did General Short at Hawaii. What did General Short and Admiral Kimmel wind up with? as a pejorative up there, it's a goat medal. Admiral Kimmel took over the Pacific Fleet on February 1st, 1941, as I previously explained, because his predecessor was fired by the President of the United States because Admiral Richardson was so strident in his views that the fleet should be taken back to the West Coast, where all war planning assumed the fleet would be prior to the movement of that fleet on a permanent basis to Hawaii. The President of the United States even forced Admiral Richardson to tell the press that it was his idea to put the fleet in Hawaii. And Richardson had to do that. He swallowed hard. Publicly, he did it. Privately, he excoriated the President. And for his reward, he was fired. My grandfather takes the job. February 1st, 1941. 17 days later, on February 18th, 1941, he writes a letter to his only uniformed boss in the Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, in which my grandfather says, I, Admiral Kimmel, have recently been told by an officer fresh from Washington, D.C., Admiral Brown, that the Office of Naval Intelligence considers it the function of operations to furnish me, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, with information of a secret nature. I've heard also that operations considers the responsibility for furnishing the same type of information to that of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Admiral Stark, I do not know that we have missed anything out here in the Pacific, but if there is any doubt as to whose responsibility it is to keep me, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, fully informed with pertinent reports on subjects that should be of interest to the fleet, will you kindly fix that responsibility so there will be no misunderstanding? A week later, Admiral Stark sent a dispatch, as they like to call it, a message back to Admiral Kimmel and said, Admiral Kimmel, fear not. The head of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Captain Kirk, is fully cognizant of his responsibility to keep you appropriately and adequately informed. Not satisfied with that. A couple of months later, Admiral Kimmel pens a second letter to his only uniformed boss in the Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, in which my grandfather said, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, me, is in a very difficult position, Admiral Stark. As you know, I am far removed from the seat of government in Washington, D.C., and I am not informed as to the policy reflected in current events. Accordingly, it is suggested that it be made a cardinal principle that the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet be immediately informed of all important developments as they occur and by the quickest secure means available. Admiral Kimmel got on a plane in June of 1941 and made the prodigious flight from Hawaii to Washington, D.C. Hand-carried that letter. Had a sit-down with the Chief of Naval Operations and delivered that letter to the Chief of Naval Operations. And once again, received all sorts of assurances that he would be appropriately and adequately informed. It's now time to start our investigation, that investigation that I promised you. Where shall we start? If you were running the investigation, where would you start? Why don't we start at the top? Let's get the Chief of Naval Operations on the stand. And that's precisely what the Joint Congressional Committee did. The General Counsel, William Mitchell, asked Admiral Stark under oath, after Admiral Stark was sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Admiral Stark, who was it that told you, sir, that they had a system out in Honolulu or Pearl Harbor of decoding and decrypting Japanese messages? It took Admiral Stark about 2 nanoseconds to cough up his operations chief, what they call the Chief of Naval Warplanes, Admiral Turner. Next step in the investigation. Let's get Admiral Turner on the stand. And that's precisely what they did. Congressman Murphy, after swearing Admiral Turner in, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, Admiral Turner, did you ever tell Admiral Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, that Admiral Kimmel was getting that information out in Honolulu, Pearl Harbor? That information, that magic information. Admiral Turner, being an honorable man, said, yes, sir. On 3 occasions, I asked Admiral Noyes, the Chief of Naval Communications, about it, and so reported to Admiral Stark. Admiral Turner went on to further testify that he went through this outrageously misrepresenting event on 3 occasions. The first time was actually in January of 1941, 1 month before Admiral Kimmel took the job. The second time was in July or August of 1941, and the third time was in November of 1941. All with the same reports back to the Chief of Naval Operations that yes, Admiral Kimmel is getting this magic information. Next step in the investigation. Now they get Admiral Noyes on the stand. And let's ask him a $64 question. Actually, it was question 64 by the Naval Court of Inquiry. Did you, Admiral Noyes, ever inform the Chief of Warplanes Division, then Captain Turner, later 4-star Admiral Turner, that the commander of the Chief of the Pacific, Kimmel, was decrypting intelligence information of a character similar to that which you were receiving in the Navy Department? In other words, magic. What was Admiral Noyes' answer? How many yes? How many no? Ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you after 25 years as an FBI investigator, when your investigation reaches this point, you have reached nothing less than an investigative epiphany. There's nowhere else to go with your investigation. You know why we are now surprised at Pearl Harbor. But my 35 years of government service tell me one other thing. What do we have so far? A mistake. It's a pretty bad mistake, but that's all we have is a mistake. I'm very familiar with mistakes from my 35 years of government service. Personal mistakes. But now the Pearl Harbor story turns perfidious, turns treacherous. We're going beyond the mistake. This is the Roberts Commission. This is the head of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Ping Wilkinson. Admiral Wilkinson testifies to the Roberts Commission. The care was taken in Washington, D.C. to see that these 2 officers, Admiral Hart in the Philippines and Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii, were kept fully advised as to developments. Admiral Hart in the Philippines and Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii had available to them the same magic information as we did here in Washington, D.C. British historian John Costello styles Admiral Wilkinson's misrepresentation to the Roberts Commission as being so misleading as to be a deliberate lie. Unfortunately, that deliberate lie, if that's what it was acquiesced to before the Roberts Commission by the head of the Army, General Marshall, by the head of the Navy, Admiral Stark, by the head of Navy Warplanes, Admiral Turner, by the head of Army Warplanes, General Garreau, and by the head of Army Intelligence, General Miles. Of course, the facts of the matter are that in no way can anybody truthfully represent that Kimmel had the same information in Hawaii as they did in Washington. It's outrageous. bring you up to date in the Pearl Harbor story. In a pretty recent edition of the Naval Institute of Proceedings, which is the #1 trade magazine for the United States Navy, the former director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Tom Brooks, had this to say in a book review. Chief of Staff George Marshall, the head of the Army, Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark, the head of the Navy, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, the Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, and the Secretary of State Cornell Hall, among others, and I'm going to get to this, among others, tried to cover up their mistakes with regard to the Pearl Harbor attack and to fix the blame on the Hawaiian commanders at the time of the attack. Senior Army and Navy officials committed perjury, suborned perjury, destroyed evidence, and intimidated witnesses. Testimony during the 9 investigations presents a sordid picture of Washington officials covering themselves at the expense of the 2 Pearl Harbor commanders. Kimmel and Short seniors in Washington shared culpability and acted in a disgraceful fashion in their attempt to deflect all the blame. For this reason alone, a compelling case can be made to restore Kimmel and Short to their pre-war ranks. Pretty strong language accusing these giants of history of lying. Well, I'd like to add one more, and that would be sitting Supreme Court Associate Justice Owen Roberts. This is information that has never been made public before, ladies and gentlemen. 11 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, the head of the FBI, Mr. J. Edgar Hoover, in a personal letter to the head of the Roberts Commission, told sitting Supreme Court Associate Justice Owen Roberts that it has been reliably reported that about 10 days before the attack, Washington deciphered messages that contained the complete plans for the attack and allegedly sent them to Hawaii, to Kimmel and Short, including code words to indicate the time of the attack. These code words were intercepted December 5th, I have a mistake there, 1941. 1941. 1941, not 2007. Oh well. I told you this was new information. Actually it is, I just got my hands on this, even though I found out it was declassified 1979. Mr. Hoover deceased in 1972, my grandfather deceased in 1968. All of these investigations had come and gone. This information was never made public to any of the investigators, to none of them. Ladies and gentlemen, if this information were true, and it was sent to Admiral Kimmel and General Short, I certainly wouldn't be here talking to you. If it were true, not only should Admiral Kimmel and General Short have been blamed, they should have been taken out and shot. But of course, this is not true. It is outrageously not true, and maybe I'll get to it in some detail a little bit. But right now, I want to focus on General Marshall. General Marshall, who was the #1 military man in the United States at that time, the man primarily responsible for warning our armed forces worldwide of the threat. The Army Pearl Harbor Board had a member by the name of General Henry Russell. Henry Russell was charged by the Army Pearl Harbor Board with investigating Washington's contribution to the Pearl Harbor attack. The Army Pearl Harbor Board was exceedingly critical of General Marshall's performance. But left unsaid was a manuscript written by General Russell, who was an Army lawyer and a combat general both. General Russell wrote a manuscript he put in his desk. He wrote it in 1946, put it in the bottom drawer of his desk. His heirs found it in 2000, and they published it in 2001. It is a remarkable book. I highly recommend it to you. If you can't find it, give me an email. I can help you out with that. Very interesting book. In pertinent part, General Russell says, I believe then, 1946, and believe now that all those responsible for our defeat at Pearl Harbor should have been dealt with alike. If one was driven out of the service, all should have been. If one was forgiven, all should have been. The selected individual as a sacrifice for the sins of the group was not only unfair, but was downright despicable. To me, the conduct of those in high places after the attack was dishonest and inexcusable. And then he goes on to talk about General Marshall. General Marshall was also a matter of concern to the Chief of Naval Operations that relieved Admiral Stark. Chief of Naval Operations throughout World War II, almost all of it, was Admiral King. Admiral King had this to say: I have never been able to understand how or why the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, could fire Admiral Stark without doing the same to General Marshall. In my opinion, one could not possibly be more suspect than the other. Well, we already know from Henry Clausen, who was a recorder for the Army Pearl Harbor Board, and Marshall's champion, not his critic, Marshall's champion. Marshall, Clausen wrote in his book, the General Marshall had without malice caused perjured testimony to be presented to the Army Pearl Harbor Board. Marshall had ordered his subordinates to lie to the Army Pearl Harbor Board, and they had complied. And indeed, General Garreau lied to the Army Pearl Harbor Board and to the Roberts Commission. General Miles, the head of Army Intelligence, lied to the Army Pearl Harbor Board and the Roberts Commission. But General Marshall was the champion. General Marshall lied to the Roberts Commission, he lied to the Army Pearl Harbor Board, he lied to the Naval Court of Inquiry, and he lied to the Joint Congressional Committee. Here's an affidavit signed by the head of Army Intelligence, General Miles, contained in the Joint Congressional Committee report. Generals Osmond and Clark, pictured here, transmitted to me instructions from General Marshall that I was not to disclose to the Army Pearl Harbor Board any facts about magic. Accordingly, I obeyed that instruction. Okay? Here's a definition of subordination of perjury. Do we have any lawyers in the group? Besides Judy, my wife. Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1622. Whoever procures another to commit any perjury is guilty of subordination of perjury and shall be fined or imprisoned not more than 5 years or both. In 1961, a professor from Georgetown University, Charles Tansel, sat down with General Bonner Fellers and General Carter Clark. Carter Clark is one of the great unsung heroes of the 20th century in that he developed the most important counterintelligence operation of World War II called Venona. Any recognition of Venona? It was the secret decoding of Soviet spy communications prior to World War II, during World War II. Carter Clark was the man in charge of that operation. Remarkable operation. I address it in one of my talks. I don't think I'm going to have time to get to it today. At any rate, at a luncheon with Carter Clark, Professor Tansel, and Bonner Fellers, Carter Clark revealed that General Marshall had made him and his staff promise not to reveal the truth about magic and something called the Winds Execute message, which was a code that the Japanese had set up to notify their non-magic holding diplomatic establishments throughout the world, the ones that didn't have the ability to read magic. They still wanted to notify them of their decision for war, and they set up a code called the Winds. I won't get into that. Marshall ordered files destroyed. Marshall obviously dragged his feet on December 7, 1941, and sending a warning to Pearl Harbor, which of course famously arrived hours after the attack. Marshall deliberately broke Army regulations by not sending this war warning message to Pearl Harbor by multiple means of communication. The Army, going back from the beginning to George Washington, has had regulations that if you have an important message, you always send it by at least 2 means of communication. And of course, General Marshall sent the Pearl Harbor communication by a single means of communication, which arrived hours later. Continuing. Here's Carter Clark revealing that information in 1961 at a private luncheon, which is all well and good. I guess he wanted to cleanse his soul before meeting his maker. The sadness here is that Carter Clark actually led one of those investigations and, of course, gave no hint of any information like this. And yet it was his job to lead one of the 10 Pearl Harbor investigations. Continuing on November 26, 1941, the Secretary of State sent an American note to the Japanese, which in effect said, get out of China or else. From reading Magic, we know that the Japanese thought that that note was a humiliating proposal. By no means could they use it for a basis of negotiations, and a timetable for the attack on Pearl Harbor was set up. We knew about the timetable. We knew about the utter rejection of the American note. We knew that the Japanese were play acting, deliberately play acting to continue the negotiations, to hide something. We knew all of this because of the decoding of Magic. Admiral Kimmel had no idea that this November 26th American note had been sent to the Japanese. When the American ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, testified before the Army Pearl Harbor Board, the Army Pearl Harbor Board styled that note of November 26, 1941 as the document that touched the button that started the war. Admiral Kimmel had no idea that that document had been sent. We did know from the decoding of Japanese diplomatic code that they were going to send a response to that November 26, 1941 American note, the document that touched the button and started the war. They were going to send a response in 14 parts. They were going to send a response in English, in elegant English, the only messages the Japanese ever sent in English. No translation required. Perfectly obvious the Japanese were writing this for history so that they could justify what they were about to do. When the 13th part of the 14-part message came in, it came in at 9:30 p.m. Saturday evening, December 6th, before Pearl Harbor. The evening before Pearl Harbor. Captain Lester Schultz, Naval Academy, 1934, delivered that note and testified to the Joint Congressional Committee that he handed it to the President of the United States. The President of the United States, after reading the 13th part, said this means war. He then handed it to his number one confidant, Karl Rove, Harry Hopkins. And Harry Hopkins also read it and agreed this means war. Investigators wondered, would it be possible for the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, to read a secret communications from the enemy, declare that this means war, and not immediately reach out for the head of his army and for the head of his navy to find out what the status was? General Marshall, perhaps the smartest man to ever graduate from Virginia Military Institute, maybe the smartest man to ever be in the United States Army, renowned for his photographic memory, was asked the question, General Marshall, you with the prime responsibility to warn our armed forces worldwide of the threat, where were you Saturday evening, the night before the Pearl Harbor attack, at about 9:30 p.m., when the President of the United States was reading a secret communication from the enemy and declaring this means war? Where were you, sir? What was General Marshall's response, his famous response? I don't remember. Okay, General, there was still plenty of time Sunday morning when the 14th part came in and what they called the pilot message came in. The pilot message was a message in Magic instructing the ambassadors, the Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C., to deliver the 14th part at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in Washington, D.C., Sunday afternoon. Diplomats don't work on Sunday afternoon, as a matter of course. Where were you, General, when this instruction, and these messages came in on Sunday morning. What was his famous response? Never really gave a response that he was riding. What he said was, my usual practice on Sunday morning was to go for a ride in Rock Creek Park. So I guess, without independent recollection, that's what I must have been doing, riding Sunday morning. Investigators, now frustrated out of their socks, said, okay, General, you don't know where you were the night before the Pearl Harbor attack, when you, with primary responsibility for warning our armed forces worldwide of the threat, when your boss was receiving a message secretly decoded from the enemy and declaring this means war, you don't know where you were. You don't know where you were Sunday morning when the instructions for the final delivery came in. Where were you, General, when you actually got word that Pearl Harbor was under attack? Now, as I look out in the audience, I don't see anybody of the appropriate age, but in case I'm wrong, if there is anybody of the appropriate age, let me ask you the question. Do you recall where you were when you got the word that Pearl Harbor was under attack? I don't believe there's that many of the appropriate age. Well, I am not of your number. I was born in 1943. But I assure you, I know just where I was when I got the word that President Kennedy had been shot. I was in physics class at the Naval Academy and remember it like it was yesterday. Let me ask you this. How many of you recall where you were when you got the word that the World Trade Center was under attack on September 11, 2007? Is there anybody who doesn't recall where they were when they got the word? Did any of you have responsibility for warning our armed forces worldwide of the threat? General Marshall, where were you when you actually got the word that Pearl Harbor was under attack? What was his response? If you'd like to check the accuracy of this, you can go to Part 3 of the Joint Congressional Committee's Pearl Harbor attack investigation at page 1109, and you can find that response, which he gave to the investigators under oath. I always like to contrast that with the response from Winston Churchill. Sir Winston, where were you when you got the word Pearl Harbor was under attack? Remember what his response was? Was at his country home, Checkers. And what was his response? Satiated with satisfaction and emotion, I went to sleep and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. Do you remember that language? It's a pretty high contrast to General Marshall. Not quite through with General Marshall yet. The head of military intelligence in Washington, D.C. was Colonel Bratton. Colonel Bratton, under oath, told the Joint Congressional Committee that General Marshall told us in August of 1941 exactly who was to be given magic. Everyone on the list was in Washington, D.C. General Marshall was asked the same question. On the distribution of magic, I gave no specific instructions that I recall. And then he went on to say, I did not know that magic was being withheld from Hawaii. We're still not quite through with General Marshall. Why didn't General Marshall pick up the telephone and alert General Short? Sunday morning, December 7, 1941. All he would have had to say was, General Short, I want you to go to General Quarters. I'll explain later. That gives away nothing. What was his answer? Under oath to this question. Alerting the garrisons could be construed as a hostile act. Warning Pearl Harbor, warning the Pearl Harbor commander could be construed as a hostile act. And he got away with that response. He got away with that response. Because it's now 1945-46. And there's no bigger hero in the United States, there's no bigger hero in the world than General Marshall. Still not quite through with General Marshall. A member of the Roberts Commission was William Stanley, Admiral William Stanley, a former chief of naval operations. Admiral William Stanley signed the unfavorable findings of the Roberts Commission, but he held his nose to do so as not to interfere with the war effort. We know this because Admiral Stanley wrote a book called Ambassador Admiral, which I highly recommend, in which he explains this is the reason he did that. He repudiated later on the findings of the Roberts Commission after the war. But he also said this: on June 17, 1940, a year and a half prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, when conditions were much less menacing than in December of 1941, Naval Intelligence lost radio track of the Japanese fleet for a few days. General Marshall sent General Herron, that's General Short's predecessor at Hawaii, a message with, as Admiral Richardson described it, with these invigorating words. General Herron now and Admiral Richardson are out in Hawaii. Head of the Army, head of the Navy, out in Hawaii. June 17, 1940, General Short gets this message from General Marshall. Immediately alert complete defensive organization to deal with possible trans-Pacific raid. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a real war warning. That's the real thing. And of course it engendered all kinds of activity that went on for months, actually, many weeks, evolving into months. Admiral Kimmel's predecessor, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Richardson's response to this alert, they call it the June 17th alert, a year and a half prior to Pearl Harbor. Under oath, Admiral Richardson said he flew patrols as a result of that alert, so it could not be said of him after the thing happened that I was warned and did nothing about it. Then he went on to explain, my aerial reconnaissance was not adequate either as to the density or as to the distance search to provide warning of any impending attack. It was a token reconnaissance. And this actually was his reconnaissance. As you can see, nearly 180 miles. Kimmel was actually conducting reconnaissance 400 miles out and was doing it to the north a week before Pearl Harbor, before his resources finally gave out. Admiral Richardson, continuing with General Marshall. In 1940, General Marshall told me that the June 17, 1940 alert had been a training exercise. However, in 1945, Marshall denied in joint congressional testimony under oath that this June 17, 1940 alert was an exercise, and he said it was the real thing, and he denied talking to me, Admiral Richardson, about it. Samuel Eliot Morrison. Samuel Eliot Morrison was the official naval historian appointed by both Presidents Roosevelt and Truman to write the official history of naval operations in World War II. Samuel Eliot Morrison was a Harvard professor. He has a ship named after him. He was a chair at the Naval Academy named after him. And he did write a multi-volume work on naval operations in World War II. Volume number 3 is called The Rising Sun of the Pacific. It was written in 1948. In that volume, he is very unsympathetic and unkind to Admiral Kimmel. It was written in 1948. But in 1961, apparently Samuel Eliot Morrison underwent his own investigative epiphany, and he wrote a letter to the head of the Naval Academy Alumni Association, Admiral Shafroff, in which he said Admiral Kimmel was no more blamable than a number of people in Washington. Admiral Turner, the head of Navy War Plans, General Garreau, the head of Army War Plans, General Marshall, the head of the Army, General Miles, the head of Army Intelligence, and Admiral Wilkinson. If I, Samuel Eliot Morrison, were pushed to name one person as being more careless or stupid than all the rest, it would be who? Or is it whom? Morrison. Kelly Turner, the one who kept telling his boss, Chief of Naval Operations, that Kimmel was getting all this information, which he clearly was not getting. If you, Admiral Shafroth, and your Naval Academy alumni friends are getting up any sort of petition to have Admiral Kimmel's status restored or a record changed, you can count on me to sign it. Roberta Wallstetter, another famous Pearl Harbor historian, is largely responsible for changing my views and ought to be thanked. You know, this is all well and good, but the whole history of Samuel L. Morrison is still being sold over and over again. So anybody who would read Samuel L. Morrison, especially this third volume, would have a very imperfect impression of his views towards Admiral Kimmel. Okay. Brandon Treaster has been most kind in giving me a long leash, but I realize you can only take so much. And the happy hour has to end sometime. So this is the way I choose to end it. Being Admiral Kimmel's grandson, I can say things in his defense he couldn't say in his own defense. I knew him well. I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1966. He deceased in 1968 at the ripe old age of 86. We were most blessed in the Kimmel family because Admiral Kimmel's mind was sharp as a Russian razor the day he died. His body finally gave out on him, but his mind was quite a thing to engage. And we saw him frequently. He was in Groton, Connecticut, where the submarine base was. My dad was a submarine officer. We would visit him every Sunday, every other Sunday for sure. And I'll be the first to tell you, you couldn't talk to the man for 2 minutes without the subject of Pearl Harbor coming up. But that was okay with me because it's been my favorite subject ever since I was a young teenager, actually. It was a delight to be around him. He was a marvelous grandfather and a consummate gentleman. In 2000, Professor Gammon, going through the 30,000 pages of my grandfather's papers, came across a draft letter that he prepared, we believe in the 1960s, mid-1960s, pretty clearly in response to a letter that he had received shortly before from Admiral Stark. Again, Admiral Kimmel's only uniformed boss in the Navy. In this draft letter that my grandfather wisely chose not to send, we think we probably have his real feelings as to how he felt he was being treated by the United States government. But again, it was a draft letter. He wisely chose not to send it. Me being his grandson, I much less wisely choose to share it with you right now. Admiral Stark, you betrayed the men of the fleet by not giving them a fighting chance for their lives. You betrayed me by not giving me information you knew I was entitled to. You betrayed me by your acquiescence in the action taken on the request for my retirement. You betrayed yourself by misleading the Roberts Commission as to what information had been sent to you. You betrayed yourself by your self-serving lapse of memory before the Naval Court of Inquiry. I hope that you never communicate with me again and that I never see you or hear or see your name again, that my memory may not be refreshed of one so despicable as you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind attention. Questions and answers? I have to tell you this before I take questions and answers. I just finished a cruise to Hawaii from Los Angeles, November 3rd to November 18th. I gave 9 lectures, an hour apiece, 9 lectures. The first lecture coincided through a couple of misadventures with the exact time that I was to get married to Judy. First day at sea on November 4th. So when I finished my lecture, I had to apologize to my audience that I didn't have time to give a lecture. And I explained why I was giving the lecture in a tuxedo because I had to immediately get married. Anyway. And that is a true story. Yes, sir.
My question, if what you say about Marshall, what he did, you then go upward and say that Roosevelt?
Wait a minute. I didn't say anything
I
about
mean,
Marshall.
I'm sorry. Whatever was said, excuse me, about Marshall,
I
okay?
try to be very careful about not saying anything. I just quote others that say.
I'm sorry.
Nobody cares what I say.
I'm not a lawyer, so my words may not be, but I'm only saying this, but that,
I would never call General Marshall a liar. There are legions of others who might. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was only going to ask, would the information that was mentioned in here somewhat lead to the fact that it was Roosevelt that gave Marshall, gave Marshall the point of saying that we must hold back on any information given to any of these inquiries?
It seems pretty clear that his loyalties were much greater up than they were down. Yes, sir.
In this General Marshall support, these hearings were conducted during the war.
All of them were conducted during the war,
And
except for the Joint Congressional Committee that was operating both during and after.
at that time, wouldn't it have been to our advantage not to let the Japanese know that we had their military, or their equivalent of the magic?
Absolutely. And we did.
In other words,
And we did. And we did.
no.
No, we did. We got secret from the
At
Japanese.
hearings during the war, they would have known.
No, that information came out during hearings during the war. It came out to the Naval Court of Inquiry, it came out to the Army Pearl Harbor Board, and it was kept secret. The Naval Court of Inquiry wrote their report in two different versions. One was an unclassified version, one was a classified version. This is the way you normally do it in the intelligence community. I'm from the intelligence community. I have investigated these matters where I have written an unclassified report and a classified report on the same matter. That's what the Naval Court of Inquiry did. They did this in order to get the facts about Admiral Kimmel to the public without impugning, without any damage to the war effort. The Secretary of the Navy went to the head of the Naval Court of Inquiry, Admiral Murfin, and said, I want you to classify the unclassified version. And Murfin said, I won't do that. I wrote it this way for a specific purpose. It does nothing to interfere with the war effort. All right? And the Secretary of the Navy classified it anyway. But in the unclassified version, there was no hint of magic. But you raise the point, and it's an excellent point. Admiral Spruance, the famous hero of the Battle of Midway, laid this out as well as anybody could. Admiral Spruance is a long, unflagging supporter of Admiral Kimmel, I might add. He wrote a letter to Samuel L. Morrison, in which he said, the Roberts Commission's proceedings might have been justifiable at that time, under the circumstances at that time, but it does not justify forever damning Admiral Kimmel. I have no problem at all with doing everything you can to keep the code and the fact that you were breaking the code secret.
That was the thing behind our success at Midway.
Well, there's a different code. It was called the Naval Code. That's a different kettle of fish. It had nothing to do with the diplomatic code. But yes, of course, it's the same people that didn't do it for Pearl Harbor that did do it for the Battle of Midway 6 months later. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask, these books are available through the Library of Congress on the internet then, aren't they?
Well,
Would they be,
which book are you talking about now? My grandfather's book is on the internet, the whole thing.
yes, but like Pearl Harbor story, would that be,
That's a little harder to find. I would try to find it. If you can't find it, send me an email. I'll get it to you. Okay? Great book. Anybody else? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, dear.
An old movie, World War II movie, were made during the